So good afternoon, and thank you for participating in this rather unusual format for Lectio. And we thank the sisters both for encouraging it and for supporting it. Let me also thank from the very beginning our filmographer, our cinematographer, Byron Wratee. And we're really pleased to have our other conversant, Chanelle Robinson. And I'm very fortunate to be with these young theologians and scholars. The enigmatic parable of a father and two sons, this parable that we read today, along with that of the Good Samaritan, are most familiar to those of us who have grown up in or been around or tutored in the cultures of the West. We know this story. We know the outcome. We know the meanings. Indeed, we have seen this parable. Think of the work of the Dutch Golden Age painter Rembrandt van Rijn. Or some of us might be moved to consider the rendering of this parable by the Belarusian Jewish artist Marc Chagall, who made his life in Paris. Or others of us might think of the works of African-American artist Aaron Douglas, or European Americans Daneil Bonnell and Anne Lukash. We know the story, we know the outcome, we know the meanings, we've seen the parable, or do we really know, and have we really seen? I want to begin with our conversation about the parable and about our synodal interaction with a quote from Amy Jill Levine from The Misunderstood Jew, the Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus. She writes, "To recover the punch of Jesus' parables, one must hear them with first-century Jewish ears. Although such an exercise cannot be fully accomplished without detailed historical study, even a cursory knowledge of the cultural influences on all Jews in the first century, such as the narratives in the Hebrew Bible, already begins the process. Any Jew who heard a story beginning, there was a man who had two sons, the opening of this famous parable, would immediately think of the brothers not getting along very well, and that the father would be generally ineffectual in bringing harmony to the household. The stories of Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, Esau and Jacob, for example, do not set up an auspicious model for the prodigal son and his dutiful older brother," close quote. We know the story, we know the outcome, we know the meanings, or do we? Perhaps if we try to hear the story through Jewish ears, try to hear the story through other cultural ears, we might interrupt our own quick traditional or conventional conclusion that this story is about sinners repenting and God graciously offering forgiveness and reconciliation. How does this story become important to us in thinking about the Synod and thinking about our challenge to listen to one another as a church? So we'd like to, in this way, explore this parable, this story, and figure out together, all of us, what it might mean to be a person who truly listens, both to requests, to pain, to joy, and to happiness. So we talked a little bit earlier about different readings of this parable. And we also talked a little bit about, let's start with something disruptive, really, what's absent? Let's start out, what's absent? Who's absent in this parable?
Absolutely. So colloquially, we know the story as the parable of the prodigal father or the prodigal son, but the mother is an absent figure, right? Do they have different mothers? Is she alive? Has she died? She is the shadow figure that I think looms in this story. And so what do we do when there is an absence that marks our understanding of family? There's often an impulse, I think, as you said, Dr. Copeland, to either read God as the Father, but in a lot of ways, the church is often ascribed this parental figure either as an ecclesial mother or what it might mean. And so when we think about the church as this, guiding maternal figure in our lives, what does it mean if she's not there? What does it mean if you feel like a motherless child? As servant of God Thea Bowman sang to the USCCB, how do we take all of these missing threads of this unnamed figure and allow her to kind of guide our lens of this parable as well?
There's a Black Catholic man who in the early 1970s, Robert L. Robinson, who is a legendary figure, was a legendary figure for me as a younger person. And he really had a line on the church and this motherlessness. He said, we want a church that is not a stepmother, using a kind of that mythos, not mythos, but the myth of the stepmother as being wicked, thinking back about Cinderella or whatever. Yeah. But also he said we want a church that doesn't merely pass for a church, which is also a kind of ringing summons to be more than just a place for coming in to experience a ritual and leaving, putting in my envelope and leaving, or sending off my note to the parish secretary for the bulletin. But something else, something more robust, something stronger, richer, holding us together in some way. What else? What else can we see here? What else can we see here? My skills as a teacher on stage.
Well, we definitely see some economic readings of this also, and class-based readings, especially when we think about it in the frameworks outside of this country, probably for instance, in an Indian context, in a context with deep class and caste structures in place, might see this reading and understand it as a way to challenge the implicit class distinctions that are being made between father and son, between older son and younger son, between slave and heir. There are many hierarchies and many castes involved in the story that we just take for granted as so-called egalitarian Americans. We just take that for granted. What does it feel like to be the older son and have so many in a class or a system where the oldest child has a lot of burden on them? I'm an African American in the truest sense. My father's Liberian, and my oldest brother had a tremendous amount of expectations put on him. He sings 10,000 times better than me. He was very smart. His life was mapped out. You're going to be a doctor. You're going to do X, Y. Just that, and that's a norm in a lot of African families, that you will model what it looks like to be the virtuous child, and will someday be the older parent, the surrogate parent when things get tough. So I think about that. I bring that to the table when I hear this story, and I also think, because I'm one of these younger children, I think from the perspective of this older child. I don't really want to see my father dead, but what if my older brother doesn't like me, and I need to get what's mine before he's in charge of the estate and doesn't want to help me. So there's a rich, complicated family dynamic that's happening in the parable, based on huge societal norms and family norms that we just don't really see and understand in the way that a Jewish culture or Jewish family would have seen in the first century.
they would have heard this very differently, very differently. You want to identify perhaps with the younger brother, but then immediately, when you hear those names like, Isaac or Abel, or you hear Jacob. But then there's a real shift here, which I think is what you're bringing forward. And so then you're nervous. You want to bring about something different because we're surprised. So hearing these parables like this, they're not rushing to the end of the parable to type onto it, this your brother who is dead to us has now come back. They're not typing resurrection Jesus on this, not at all. No one has any idea in that listening. The listeners have no idea what is going to happen. They have no idea whatsoever. They're just hearing this young rabbi tell this story. And it's in a context of finding what's lost. Because there's other parables here as well at work that we're not paying attention to so much. But.
Absolutely, right? Amy Levine mentions this, that the parables are a set of threes, that there's the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost sheep, and then the parable of the prodigal son. And so in the first two, there's a reunion that takes place. The coin is reunited with its owner, the shepherd finds the sheep. But in the third parable, we really aren't greeted with a happy story at all. It's a story of a lot of fracturing within that unification. When we look at the story of the older brother at the end, when the party is taking place, there's this large feast. He is so upset. He's really wrestling with this belonging, with this sense of uniting that's happening, this joining, so to speak. And the father says to him, everything I have is yours. And so what does it mean to have everything and still participate in a sense of refusal to be in relation with others?
And bringing up those other two parables is key because the parable of the lost coin is a parable about an inanimate object.
Yes.
And the parable of the sheep is a parable of finding a non-human creature that doesn't have the same rational capacity as a human being. But it gets a lot messier, a lot more complicated when you're dealing with the coming together of human beings. And so the parable this final parable gives us the space for reunion, but doesn't force on to human beings the same type of non-agency. You're still here. You still have to participate in the reunion and in the coming together in place. And it's just not resolved in the parable at all.
It's imperfect,
It's
absolutely.
We were thinking in terms of a kind of disruptive reading that Ruben Manohar presents. Reading from the perspective of a Dalit Christian in India, and he ends up by saying to us, just a quick read, he says, the parable invites vigilance. Watch out for spiritual leadership that imitates and reproduces caste-based and other hierarchies. The parable seems to say, watch out for systems that perpetuate exploitation and discrimination of those on the margins of power. That's important for us, I think, as a church trying to enter into this complex possibility of really listening and really hearing one another. So if you are in leadership, we don't want anyone to imitate or reproduce caste-based hierarchies, whether you're in a parish or in a school or in any kind of organization.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out how do we then facilitate people's creativity, participation, or if you like the word agency, how do we facilitate that? How do we do that? And how do we do that first by listening? So one of the things, maybe to get us to talk a little bit about this is it's a wonderful quote that we have from James Cone. He says, how can people think about God and treat their neighbors as subhuman? It's a provocative question because we're all thinking, oh no, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. Or we're not doing it consciously or intentionally, but it might mean that we are not paying attention carefully enough to our own behavior.
Mhm. I love James Cone and the God bless his soul. What the challenge, his statement in all of his work, what he's often challenging us to do is to think about how we image God naturally, gracefully, graciously, without any work on our part, just as a human being, to be children of God, to be images of God, and how the way we live together and interact with each other can frustrate that. And to listen sympathetically to prophetic voices that are longing not for anything other than the recognition of their divinely given humanity. So, and the scripture tells us this, like, how can you say you love God when you've never seen Him? Never seen Him, but you don't love the human beings that image God every day, the human beings that you can see and take hold of and love. And so that scripture is true, and so is this statement. And it challenges the church to think about our complicity in roles. This is one of the biggest things that we had a recent, I listened to a recent lecture by Shawn Williams on the role of racism within religious orders, within the Catholic Church. And there was a deep discussion about whether the church was even participating in racist structures, or was it forced onto the church as virtue, by just virtue of being in a racist culture. And in some ways, it's a hard question to answer. It's a little bit of both. But the church is definitely, there's racism in the church, and there's and that has to be acknowledged. There's sexism in the church. There's multiple forms of oppression in the church. But we're journeying together and towards the kingdom and the kinship of God. And that requires deep listening. I love the image for the synodal process, which is this, the bishop in the back, children in wheelchairs in the front, and all of us, so the little child is leading us, and we have the Pope, journeying with us and encouraging us as we go along. That's really what we're doing here. It's not perfect, but we're trying to listen and journey together towards the kingdom. And and Cone is asking us to think about that. Like, how can you do this? How can you journey towards God and not see the people journeying with you?
I mean, to push that is to say a little bit, is to ask us to examine our own behaviors. I mean, I know that I write a lot about bias, but I think one of the things that we forget is that we all have the capacity for bias. And it's nice to say, but to say back to yourself, Shawn Copeland, you have a capacity for bias. And so it means then a kind of ongoing self-examination, not in a narcissistic, navel-gazing way, but in a way which takes into account relationships. Relationships. And who am I in relationship with, and how am I behaving? What am I doing in that relationship? What's at work in that relationship that's healthy and what is not? And what is my contribution, perhaps, to it being unhealthy, to being unhealthy?
Absolutely. I think, Dr. what you're touching on is a question of reflexivity. What does it mean for us to interrogate ourselves individually, but also as a church? And I think in this question, James Cone is inviting us to meditate on a corrective, that there's something incompatible taking place when we deny the goodness and dignity of another human person while also professing faith in Jesus of Nazareth.
It's easy to be swept away by the tide of the culture. Doesn't matter who you are, to be caught up in the processes. But But the challenge of the church is to be countercultural in its concern for the hopes and griefs and sorrows and joys of people, wherever they may be. And that takes a lot of courage. And so when we think about, many courageous people in the hierarchy, we think about Oscar Romero, for instance. And we've just had a string of feasts this month to remember people who have died fighting for those who are marginalized. We can catch on to not only the life-changing experience, but we can also, I think, pay attention to how significant it is to think about life for people. So if we go back to the parable for a minute, or the story of the son and the father, what was life-giving? What's life-giving here in this relationship? And so we pulled out something that's life-giving, not life-giving between the two brothers, but the father is saying, we've got a chance again.
Yes.
We've got a chance again to be a family. We've got a chance again. And so the appeal is to come into the house. And in a certain way, you might say that appeal to come into the house is not at that moment being addressed to Black Catholics who are in the house, but the people who don't want to be in the house. And so there has to be a pull. Someone has to be saying to us, maybe we all need to be here. Our parish, St. Catherine Drexel Parish in Dorchester, Roxbury, Boston, is reading Uncommon Faithfulness during parts of Lent. And Dr. Cecilia Moore presented a chapter on the work of Bishop Waters in North Carolina in the early 50s, and how he desegregated a church, and the kind of blowback that he received for that. But he was determined to try to do what was the right thing. And of course that's complicated because we close the black church or all to go to the white church. But what happens?
Yeah.
What happens? Then we find out that people who belong to that white church, the white parish, don't want to go there because there are going to be black people there now.
Yeah.
So there has to be, we can all say, well, we're beyond all that now. We don't do that. But I don't think it's quite true. I think we're not. And this is really the challenge. This is our challenge in the sense of listening to the stories of all sorts of people, certainly the black people, certainly the stories of women, certainly the stories of gay and lesbian, transgender people. Listening to the environment for a change. Listening to the environment for a change. Listening in a real way to people who are crying out to us to pay attention. And so I think one of the challenges keeps being listening and to trying to figure out what does that mean for us to listen and respond. So we have cultural resonances here. I was saying earlier to Chanelle that maybe we people here in the middle of the North American continent respond very quickly, whereas in Canada they're a little bit more reflective, and she sort of said, but I thought, well, maybe people in Mexico are causing more, you know. But I think one of the things we need to learn, certainly as people who live in the United States, not to act so quickly. I mean, this is our gift, and it's also our problem. We need to disrupt our action in order to really listen to people, because we only think we know what they're saying. We may not really.
And we hear, I've been fortunate to participate in a number of listening sessions connected to the Synod across the country in the Pacific Northwest, here in the Northeast, and even in the South. And across the board, in my listening, I hear the same issues, you know, racism, sexism, specifically the place, the lack of women's voices within the liturgy, within leadership roles, within the administration of the church, the insistence on recognizing the dignity and the worth of LGBTQ Catholics. We baptize babies, we don't baptize adults as much as we want to, and so sometimes we baptize trans and LGBT babies, and they're Catholics. And so LGBT Catholics that are being marginalized and pushed out of the church, and then the environment. Like every day, I think about the Eucharist as this great source and summit of the faith, in large part because I meet Jesus and the whole community of faithful, the choir of angels, the whole, everybody's there and symbolized and brought together in the work of human hands and the fruit of the earth.
Yes.
And so to not hear the voice of the earth, or hear the voice of animals and all of the creaturely life that is participating and moving and journeying with us towards the kingdom, towards the kingship of God, we don't have we've been talking about this too, we don't have fully informed conscience. We have informed our conscience. We form our conscience together in discernment, in community with one another. And that means listening to stories that don't come from my perspective. It's the only way I can know more. I am finite. I don't know as much as the other. They don't know as much, but we need all the stories in order to act in an informed way. And I think really what the church is suffering from is that we act too quickly without enough information. And we just need, I'm so happy that the Pope has just allowed us to stop as a church and really just listen to one another.
I think something that I appreciate about the church too is that we sometimes think slowly, and that includes deliberation,
Yes.
that includes listening, it includes dialogue, it includes documents and writing. And so I think that the shift towards synodality is a re-envisioning, an inhale of what that type of deliberation can look like on the local level, and really kind of empowering the faithful, the baptized faithful, to recognize that they are the very fabric of the people of God, of the sensus fidelium,
Yes.
and that your voices and your perspectives matter.
Yes, 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 yes. And that to have a perspective, to have a formed conscience requires work on our part.
Yes.
So in this way, if you think you don't know about Black Catholics, well then there are things that you can read. There are people that you can meet after you've read, after you're prepared to connect with people in some way. I think we all need to know something more about each other, culturally speaking. We need to know the stories, certainly in a parish of Irish members. We need to know the story of Polish members. We need to know the story of German members. We need to know the story of Italian members. We just don't know. We don't know. But there's a way to know. We don't know the stories of Japanese Catholics or Korean Catholics or Chinese Catholics. We just don't know. And in a certain way, by trying to learn those stories, we start to think about, given your description earlier about all of us moving forward, for me, we're all, in this sense, part of the body of Christ. Because the body of Jesus of Nazareth certainly is material, and we are matter, and it's made out of the same stuff that everything else is made out of. And so in that way, his earthly life starts exactly the way yours did, and yours did, and mine did, and everyone. It just starts the same way. So that there is a sameness to us, just as there is a difference, and the difference isn't just random or it's real. It's real, and it's part of who we are. I think the other point that we made, Chanelle, which is also very interesting, is that sometimes we should appreciate the church things slowly. So we're getting it. We're either too fast or too slow, and in that way, it's the idea of sort of turning the ship. How hard it is to do that. You can't, the ocean liner headed toward the Titanic, toward the iceberg, the Titanic headed toward the iceberg, can't stop in a minute. But it starts, you have to slow it down, but that means you have to have foresight.
Right.
You have to be alert and attentive. And so you have to be attentive to the world around us. And so that's really part of our challenge of formation of conscience. It's part of our challenge of what it means to be church.
Chanelle, you brought something up, something that I think is important just from the perspective, I think, of some of the African American tradition, and that's the importance of orality. And definitely important here. We're studying stories that were told and then written later. And that's the beauty of the Catholic tradition. That's why this is a living tradition, because it's really what has been told to you by your abuela, what's been told to you by your big mama. That really we pass down the faith first and foremost through stories, through oral culture. And yes, we write. We're very literate people, and we love to read and to write.
Right.
But this process is inviting us as a church back into the story, the orality of listening and hearing, and it's important. It's important. That's what Jesus has done for his disciples. He taught in parables, in very puzzling. I call him a spoken word artist. Very puzzling stories that just
Jesus
really
is rapping already.
He's a rapper. Jesus is a rapper.
Spoken word artist is good though, because he's really painting a concrete picture, but that is really very complex,
Yes.
and that is three-dimensional. It's really, well, it's multi-dimensional, it's not just three, it's multi-dimensional, because in some senses, we get the interior of the characters. The son is planning, I'm starving, I'm gonna go home. What am I gonna say? So he rehearses. Amy Jill Levine is a little suspicious of his rehearsal. She encourages us to be in that way, which is why the Ruben Menhar's comment about beware of systems that perpetuate exploitation and discrimination. People who've got the prepared statement, it's all ready. And I'm going to read it to you, we're all set, we're all ready to go now. But underneath that is it simply perpetuating what always has been. So it asks for a deeper listening and a deeper reflection about what are the consequences of our choices and our actions.
I'll be a slave in my father's house. And then his brother says the same thing. You treat me like a slave.
Yes. And Levine translates that with the word. I didn't verify the Greek for myself. I don't know if you did, but she uses it, and that's precisely, I think, that's accurate. I mean, the ancient world is filled with slavery. It's an accepted part of the ancient world. It's not chattel slavery as we know it, but it's not without abuse, particularly for women.
This posture of listening, though, is difficult, right? Because sometimes, and I imagine perhaps this was the case when the crowds were listening to the parables, you hear stories that you don't like, or stories that challenge you, that don't necessarily reinforce your worldview. But listening is that openness, it's that vulnerability to say, yes, I am hearing you and I'm receiving what you have to say.
Part of the slow part of listening is that we can come back and ask another question. We can go away and reassemble, and maybe one of the tasks for all of us in this process is being willing to go back over what we've heard and to really meditate, having heard it, meditate on it, think about it, maybe do some research about what's going on. And then come back and have another conversation.
Yes.
So that this is a sustained way of interacting. I mean, I think if you think about this, perhaps this is part of what the Pope is gifting the church with. A new way of proceeding, to borrow a phrase from the Jesuits, a new way of proceeding, which would include not only the encounter in a conversation, but a reflection, and then coming back for another conversation, and then begin some discernment about what we should do as opposed to simply acting immediately.
I like the emphasis on discernment there, for sure.
Is this your dissertation?
No, it's not.
I think if people are interested, certainly in continuing to think about Black Catholic participation, to think about what difference the experience of African Americans means in the Catholic Church. I mean, there's this new research report, Black Catholics in America, which the sisters have posted. But there's a lot more here, because in some ways, people tend to think that whatever passes for culture among African Americans is pathological, as opposed to positive. And so there's a way that you have to get to know people to understand the culture. And we look at Black Protestants in particular, let's say Baptists, and we say, oh, well, that's what it means to be Black and Christian. It is in so much as Baptists are carrying the culture.
They're carrying the culture.
They're carrying the culture, and they're mediating their faith through their culture.
Yeah.
And when Black Catholics discover our culture, again, because it's not as if we don't have it at home, it's just that we've had to keep it out of church.
Yes.
So that when you're in a Black parish, then the culture emerges as a way of mediating faith.
Yes.
And this is precisely what's going on in the Christian scriptures. We're meeting people of different cultures, certainly different from us, but we're meeting there, Jews mostly, but also Samaritans, also Syrophoenicians. We're meeting
Romans.
Yes, yes. And there's a growing constant openness from the point of view of Jesus to all these people.
Yes.
Because, I mean, the Jews who were present at one point, who's a centurion, has a sick, I think he's the son of the servant, they say, this is a good man. He helped to pay for our synagogue. Go, listen to him. Hear his cry, hear his plea. So there are ways in which there's an ongoing set of concerns here, mediated through culture, that are both human concerns, but that are expressed in particular ways. And I think that's really part of what's at stake in trying to think about culture and worship, because we tend to want to, and there's only one way to do it. Well, there isn't.
And I'm so happy you brought up the Baptist, because James Cone, in one of his early works, Malcolm and Martin and Malcolm in America, talks about how his own tradition, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, was the first independent Black church in the world, and definitely in the United States, was originally in the Methodist Episcopal Church and was together, white and Black together, and a deep struggle to want to be together, but they left not because of doctrine, he said. It was never an issue of doctrine. It was the ethic of white supremacy and racism.
Yes.
And so they had to create separate spaces, not to be a different form of Methodism, but to be Black people and Black Christians that had institutions that supported their identities. And so I see the same thing in the Catholic Church, but just so different, because we're radically committed to being Catholic. And how can we be Catholic without, it's considered a whole, to be together in whole. But the creation and the sustainment of Black Catholic parishes allows for the culture to be celebrated in a way that is not, where it's not dismissed. But I've never been to a Black Catholic parish that didn't have my parish parishioners.
Exactly.
They're not exclusionary spaces, they're not things. It's just a space where the culture of Black people can be used to mediate the divine, the faith
Yes.
that we know.
Yes.
And the majority of Black Catholics do not attend Black parishes.
That's
They're
right.
in there,
That's
the
right.
survey has told us this, they're in predominantly white multicultural parishes. So it's just about going and engaging the Black Catholic that you know and making room for their cultural expressions within all churches, not just Black parishes.
Yes. And Black Catholics, the survey says, are more likely than white or Hispanic Catholics to say that opposing racism and sexism are essential to being a faithful Christian.
I am really happy that we are meditating with this parable and thinking with the constellation of languages and cultures that it brings to us as we also try to meditate on this synodal process, this praxis of listening that we are all enacting as a global church.
I am too, but I really do see the whole process as a gift from the Holy Father, and but gifts are meant to be used, and they become yours as a certain chance. So even though the Pope has laid out a guideline for us, I'm so happy to see that the sisters and Catholics across the world have just really taken the gift and try to reuse it and reimagine it in other ways. And I hope we continue to be a listening church long after the Synod on the Synod is done.
Well, I agree with both Chanelle and Byron. And we want to thank again the sisters for the opportunity to be in conversation. And we hope that we've given you something to think about in terms of the parable and how we might approach lost sheep, lost coins, and lost brothers and sisters. And how we don't want to lose our brothers and sisters. So thank you.